السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد وسلم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستنصره ونستجيره ونستهديه، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد، النبي الخاتم الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا الله يا رب العالمين، نسألك أن تقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، ونسألك أن تقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك، ونسألك يا رب أن ترزقنا من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها. Time and again, embedded within my conscience, and I would say what should be embedded in the conscience of every Muslim who takes his or her religion seriously, is Allah's refrain in Surah Al-Imran, وَلِتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And again in the same surah, this is further underscored. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. Allah's command, which is actually a covenantal charge, be a nation. Be a nation that calls for what is good and combats and resists and challenges and seeks to fight and stop what is evil. And then Allah's refrain that indeed you are the best nation, you are the best people, you are the best bearers of Allah's message if this is what you engage in. If you discharge your obligation to recognize what is good and advocate for it, to become a living force for the establishment of goodness, and to become a living and active force against what is evil, what is foul, what is ugly, what is not beautiful. That charge, in a world that we currently occupy, that for every conscientious Muslim, the nature of the world in which this Muslim, the nature of the world that in which the nature of the world that a Muslim occupies, in so many ways results in a cognitive dissonance. So much of our world challenges the ability of a Muslim to even make sense of Allah's charge. Be a nation that upholds what is good and resists what is evil. What is a Muslim scholar? What is a Muslim student? What is a Muslim intellectual is supposed to do when you are cognizant of Allah's command to be an agent, a living agent, a living demonstrative example of the dynamic power of Islam to pursue goodness and to ward off evil. That charge, al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, in its essence, in its core, is precisely that. You as a Muslim become a dynamic, demonstrative example of the way that Islam can pursue goodness and can ward off evil. Right before the khutbah, you get a news item of the kind that Muslims now are all too accustomed to receiving. And the level of cognitive dissonance is such that we have been as if programmed to immediately marginalize the news item and discount it from our lives so our lives can continue with some semblance of order and sensibility. And the news item is this: suicide bomb attack on Kabul kills 19 young women in a school. This followed twin bombings at schools in the same neighborhood earlier this year, and a 2021 blast that killed 80 people, most of them female students, while wounding 300 others. Because they're Afghanis, because human psychology develops coping mechanisms as seamlessly as it constructs reality in endless, inventive, and imaginable ways. We have been programmed not to pause and to ponder what a news item like this one tells us about our current Muslim world. Can you imagine the theology and the thought process that goes in convincing a young man, or even perhaps a young woman, to blow themselves up, to kill fellow Muslim women in a school, and to tell them that killing Muslim women who are attending school is a praiseworthy act in God's eye. And in fact, you secure your place in Jannah by killing these girls who are attempting to get an education. And what do you think the reasoning process is? Well, the reasoning process is that these women seeking an education are engaged in a program that follows in the footsteps of Satan. That women in our society getting an education is in one way or another lending credence, lending legitimacy, lending support to the colonizer of our country. Our country was invaded by Russians, and then our country was invaded by Americans. And in one way or the other, Afghani women receiving an education is supporting the colonial project of the foreigner in Afghani lands. So when you kill these young Afghani girls, you are in fact striking a blow. You are in fact striking a blow to the Western or the Westernizing project in the Muslim world. You are striking a blow to the remnants of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. You are striking a blow to the remnants of the American invasion of Afghanistan. And if the price to pay is the lives of these schoolgirls, well, somehow the suicide bomber is made to believe that that's an entirely acceptable price to pay in the paradigm of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, in the paradigm of enjoining what is good and resisting what is evil. You pause for a second, because in every sense, the mere image of 20-some young Muslim girls blown to pieces, mutilated by the power of the blast, laying dead, and all the other girls that sustain wounds that will stay with them for the rest of their lives, is made to be an acceptable tapestry upon which to write statements of defiance to your colonizer. The bodies of Muslim women become the platform upon which you stick your tongue out to your colonizer, upon which you flip your colonizer. You say, here, I'm giving you an obscene gesture to defy you. But the price is written on the bodies of Muslim women. But you see, this is connected in so many ways to another picture, another image that emerges from the Muslim world. The protests in Iran, which continue with Iranian women getting fed up with being the platform, the tapestry, upon which Iran, as a reaction to the colonial project implemented by the Shah of Iran, after the revolution, Iran became preoccupied with defying the colonial project that was clearly being implemented from the time that Britain, France, and Russia, powers that rarely came together as colonial projects, but they did come together to dominate and subjugate Iran. And through the entire span of the 19th century and the 20th century, onto the 21st, but particularly the 19th century and the 20th century, colonial powers, which often could not agree on anything, would agree on the necessity of subjugating Iran, making sure that it never emerges as a Muslim power in any sense. If Iran emerges as a power that is thoroughly secular, thoroughly westernized, that is a natural ally of Israel in the region, that was deemed to be acceptable. But if Iran in any way turns to its Islamic heritage, then the program of subjugation was quite clear. And unfortunately, yet again, despite the brilliant principles of the Iranian Revolution and the lofty goals and the endless hopes, when it came time to defy the colonizer, once again, it was the bodies of Muslim women that were used to make a statement of defiance to the colonizer. I visited Iran during the time of the Shah. And Iran at the time of the Shah, very much, at least the urban centers, Tehran itself, I still remember how surprised I was that pornographic magazines were sold at corner streets, and the excessive, nearly extreme display of sexual promiscuity, as if Iran at the time wanted to be more westernized than the West itself, which is a very common phenomenon among colonized countries. But to get to the point where Muslim women, instead of being won heart and soul to become a part of the ummah that enjoins what is good and resists what is bad, Muslim women are fetishized in becoming a stereotypical, caricatured symbol of defiance to colonialism by a largely meaningless act, and that is being forced to cover their hair. Both in very different ways. Obviously, Afghanistan, far more extreme. But Muslim women being forced to becoming the fodder, the ammunition, the tool to make a statement of defiance. In the meanwhile, as some psychotic criminal group decides to murder Muslim schoolgirls in Afghanistan, and as mullahs in Iran decide to continue discounting the autonomous will, the free self-determination of Iranian women, to insist on canceling the voice of Iranian women, and to tell them, whether you are convinced or not, this is how you are going to attire yourself. Forgetting all about the Quranic teaching that there's no coercion in religion. Forgetting all about the fact that if you are coerced to wear the hijab, even if it is a requirement, if you are coerced to wear it, there is no hasanat that accrue from it. Forgetting about or choosing to turn a blind eye to the deep hypocrisies that ail Iranian society. Everyone knows of deep, entrenched corruptions that have seeped into Iranian society. And as the mullahs sit comfortably saying, as long as out in public Iranian women are covering their hair, we are going to pretend everyone, when they go home, is a pious Muslim, is a good Muslim, is still a believing Muslim. Although everyone knows that this is far from the case. Everyone knows that the policies of coercion in which Muslim women were forced to bear the undue burden of defiance to colonialism has resulted in losing the hearts and minds of Muslim women. You've dominated their bodies, but you've alienated their hearts and minds. They'll wear the chador in your streets But the minute they go home, they have no regard for you, or your laws, or your fiqh, or your thought, or your theology. You were the best nation. The best nation in joining what is good and resisting what is evil. Allah, Ya Rabb, is this what it's supposed to look like? Afghani girls in Iran being murdered, Iranian women being abused in police custody and murdered, Iranian women reaching a point of being so sick of everything that they're taking off their hijabs and burning them in public. Meanwhile, I read that since the 1990s, 4 million Muslims were killed in Western wars with Muslims. 4 million Muslims since the 1990s have lost their lives in Western instigated wars in Muslim countries. This doesn't include the Rohingyas of Burma. This doesn't include the Uyghurs of China. This doesn't include Muslims who have been killed, for instance, in the Philippines. It doesn't include those who are killed in non-Western wars. But 4 million Muslims are eradicated in wars instigated by the West. If you're interested and you want to hear more, check out C.G. Worldman, who talks about this and other issues. Ya Allah. So, Ya Allah, Ya Rabb, Afghani schoolgirls blown to pieces, Iranian women boiling with dissatisfaction and anger, blaming your religion, Ya Rabb, blaming your sunnah, blaming your tradition. Meanwhile, an actual Holocaust against Muslims, an actual Holocaust. And Ya Rabb, Ya Allah, when I check what Muslims are talking about, they're still having debates about hijab. They're still having debates about nail polish. They exist practically oblivious. Their cognitive dissonance has reached a point where they think that 4 million Muslims can perish just in wars instigated by the West. and that they still are entitled to organize and manage their lives as if nothing exceptional is going on. A small event brings so much into focus and comments so powerfully, so poignantly, so eloquently about our state as Muslims. Recently, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi passed away. Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi came to prominence when I was still a teenager upon the publication of his book, Al-Islam, Al-Halal wal-Haram fi Islam. And at the time, Wahhabis attacked Yusuf al-Qaradawi vigorously because they thought that his book, Al-Islam, Al-Halal wal-Haram, or Al-Halal wal-Haram fi Islam, is so liberal that they accused him of being westernized because he didn't ban music and he allowed certain things in art and painting and the like. They used to mock his book and call it Al-Halal wal-Halal in Islam. In other words, claiming that he hardly makes anything haram. The big controversy eventually was Qaradawi, was that Qaradawi refused to condemn suicide attacks carried out by Palestinians against Israelis, even if the targets were a civilian target. I debated this matter with Yusuf al-Qaradawi in Qatar. And Qaradawi's perspective was that all of Israelis are colonizers. They have no right to be in Palestine. And all Israelis could turn into a fighting force because men and women serve in the Israeli military. And one day they have civilian jobs, the other day they're carrying a weapon to kill Palestinians. I still took issue with Qaradawi's position on ethical and moral and legal grounds, because I thought it made assumptions that were not factually verifiable about who is a combatant and who is not a combatant. Eventually, Qaradawi changed his position and realized that targeting civilians in these suicide attacks did not serve the Palestinian cause, and indeed hurt the Palestinian cause. During Qaradawi's lifetime, he produces close to 100 different volumes of works on Islamic law. In the events leading to the Arab Spring, Qaradawi becomes a prominent voice in the pro-democracy movement from an Islamic perspective. Qaradawi's long life friend and collaborator was Sheikh bin Bayya, who is a member of Majlis al-Hukama of Qatar, of the Emirat. Both bin Bayya and Qaradawi created الاتحاد العالمي لعلماء المسلمين, the International Union for Muslim Scholars, an influential organization that at one point had a very close relationship with the Azhar University in Egypt. The current Sheikh of Azhar, Ahmad al-Tayyib, was a student of Sheikh al-Qaradawi, as bin Bayya was a close friend of Sheikh al-Qaradawi. But when Qaradawi died, not a word of condolences was heard from Ahmad al-Tayyib, the Sheikh of Azhar. Not a word of condolences was heard from bin Bayya. Not a word of condolences was heard from Majlis al-Hukama al-Muslimin, the organization that bin Bayya heads in the Emirat and that Hamza Yusuf is a member of. Qaradawi, who wrote 100 different works, one of the most influential figures, whether you agree with him or not, of Islam in the modern age, complete silence after he dies from Azhar, from all the religious institutions in Egypt, including the school that he graduated from at Azhar, and his long life partner and collaborator and friend bin Bayya. In fact, the Emirat makes it clear no one is allowed to do Salat al-Ghaib on the soul of Qaradawi, and no one is allowed to communicate condolences. The only thing that is allowed to be printed in Egypt, the Emirat, and Saudi Arabia are articles accusing Qaradawi of being a terrorist or a supporter of terrorism. The friends of old, the students of old are completely silent. bin Bayya, Ahmad al-Tayyib, Ali Gom'a are completely silent. But even more, you want to measure the influence of the Emirat and Saudi upon Muslims in the West? Listen carefully and see how many places on the podiums of the Prophet are going to say anything that communicates condolences for the death of this grand scholar of Islam. Social pathologies develop from unresolvable paradoxes in the psychology of the Ummah. If the Ummah learns that 1 plus 1 is not 2. And the up is not up, and down is not down, and north is not north, and south is not south. In other words, when the voice of conscience in the ummah, the so-called scholars, learn to be cowardly, hypocritical, to be treacherous, without loyalty, without principles, to be despots who use the religion like shoes that they wear on their feet to get them where they want. But once they get there, they take off the shoes and put them aside. It is the most natural thing. The most natural thing. When this is the state of the ummah, for the same people to take the easy way, the easy route, and resist colonialism through the laziest and the most dishonest means. And that is to use the bodies of women to resist colonialism. Instead of saying something that truly resonates in the world of ideas, instead of excelling in knowledge, instead of building institutions of knowledge that truly can return the gaze upon colonialism. No, the easy way out, cover up women, make a statement through a piece of cloth that tells women you can't show your hair. Make all Muslims in the world think that this is the hottest issue. If a prominent scholar dies, who cares? As long as we get together and we read Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyya, or we read some mechanical book on theology and have a discussion about correct tawheed and about all the ways that there are rules and restrictions upon women, and as long as we remain our segregated spaces, and then we feel good about ourselves, and we go around patting ourselves on the back, thinking we've actually discharged the obligation of being an ummah that actually enjoins the good and resists with the evil. While in fact, what we've done is that we've embodied the idea of Hizb al-Shaytan, the party of Satan, Satan himself. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجيب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. How could it be? How could it be that 4 million Muslims lose their lives since the 1990s in wars instigated by the West alone? And there is no reaction that doesn't light up a fire, that doesn't produce an earthquake, a radicalization of the way Muslims think about morality and ethics, about a sense of priorities. When you have such an immense casualty list, how do you still have the heart to make hijab an issue? one way or the other. Listen, an article comes out where Amnesty International yet again documents Facebook complicity in the genocide against the Muslim Rohingyas in Myanmar. The consequences upon Facebook, the consequences to Facebook from being complicit in a genocide that took place against Muslims is zero. Amnesty's report has no splash beyond the field of experts or so-called experts in international human rights. Facebook knows there is no political cost attached to simply dismissing Amnesty's report and saying, because Amnesty, among what it did, is it suggested that Facebook should pay reparations to the families of the Rohingyas who were butchered in the genocide. And of course, Facebook dismissed the whole idea and said, we're not going to pay reparations. In Italy, a fascist party, literally a fascist party, with clear ideological ties to Mussolini's regime, the same regime that butcherized Muslims in Libya, the crimes against humanity committed by the Italian regime against Muslims in Libya, no one talks about, no one cares about. But the entire Muslim population of Libya was placed in a concentration camp. Well, the descendants of that regime have just been elected to power in Italy. And the reaction of our government is to minimize their fascism and to describe them as conservative centrists. Why does that matter? Well, because of yet another thing. That matters. Let me just share with you the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has a Human Dimension conference in Warsaw. And in that conference, held by this organization, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, at the conference, extensive material, was reviewed about the rise of rampant Islamophobia in Europe. And particularly, the report goes into great detail about the explosion in Islamophobia and discrimination against Muslims, particularly in countries such as France and Denmark, and discusses an operation engaged in, a very Islamophobic operation engaged in by the Austrian government called Operation Luxor, in which 70 Muslim households were raided and 30 Muslim academics and activists were arrested, but none were charged with any crimes. The report per this conference, documents a terrifying picture in which Muslims all over Europe, particularly France, Denmark, and Austria, and Germany, and now Italy, are systematically denied their civil rights, as Islam is systematically vilified and demonized by the ruling parties and by the active governments in these countries. Europe, there is a rising fascism and racism in Europe that is going to change the face of the world that we live in. And the first victims of this rising fascism in Europe and the coming genocides that are going to be committed will not be Jews this time, it will be Muslims. If you want to know how it will taste like, go back and study the Bosnian genocide. Go back and read how millionaires paid millions of dollars to go on weekends to snipe for the privilege and the pleasure of sniping Muslims for fun. You want to add irony above irony? While Muslims are busy debating things like hijab and things like nail polish, and while Muslims, if they're Sunni, they're busying themselves with the evils of Shi'ism and how much they hate Shia. And if they're Shi'i, they preoccupy with all the conspiracies that Sunnis have to eradicate Shi'ism from the face of the universe. While Muslims are engaged in this, radical Hindus into the Hindutva movement realize that no one cares if the victims are Muslims, and that they will not be able to successfully carry their genocide against Muslims in India unless they invest in the rise of Hindu nationalism in the West, and they contribute to the radicalization of Western politics against Muslims. So, in a very organized, methodical movement, they organize these demonstrations, well-funded demonstrations, by Hindu nationalists in Muslim neighborhoods, in Leicester, England. And the instructions they have is to provoke. And once provoked, call the police. And the way that the British media has been covering these events was exactly as the Hindu nationalists predicted. Muslims will never be seen as victims. And the way the media reports it is simmering tensions. Ethnic conflict broke out, while in reality, it is Hindu nationalist provocation and victimization and targeting of Muslims. The irony is that the Hindu nationalists buddied up with Zionists to learn how to provoke and dominate and subjugate Muslims. The close ties between the Hindu nationalist government of India and the successive governments of Israel is well known and well documented. But if this makes sense, how do you make sense of the fact, in another element of cognitive dissonance, that the other very close partner to the Hindu nationalist, Islamophobic government of India that is now extremely active in spreading Islamophobia in Europe and the United States is the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who gave that same ideological movement in the share of the profits of Hajj, and who Bin Bayya, who is completely silent about the death of Yusuf Qaradawi, is closely allied with, and who Hamza Yusuf, sitting there in his Zaytuna Institute, is completely subservient to. That is why you will never hear a word about Hindu nationalism. You will never hear a word about Israel. You will never hear a word about Palestinian rights. Indeed, you will never hear a word about the 4 million Muslims slaughtered since the 1990s. Indeed, you will not hear a word about the Uyghur Muslims or the Rohingyas. So, what issue are you going to hear about? Tawheed, hijab, nail polish, music. I'm going to close with one final example. As usual, the news of Israel killing Palestinian children, it has become so commonplace. A 7-year-old Palestinian boy dies after an Israeli army chase. Here is the boy, 7-year-old boy that is killed as the Israeli army is chasing a 7-year-old boy. Gruesome details about how he was coughing blood before he expired. 4 other Palestinians are killed in a Jenin raid. But meanwhile, close to home, there is a journalist, an American journalist, I want to make sure I don't misremember her name, but I might have. Helen Keller, I think her name is, but I can't find the article. Recently, Rashida Talibi made a comment that got her in deep hot waters. In a statement in Congress, she said, "You cannot be truly a progressive if you ignore the genocide that is taking place." You cannot be truly a progressive if you ignore the apartheid state that exists in Israel. Recently, Amnesty International issued a report that was, of course, ignored, identifying, clearly accusing Israel of committing the international crime of an apartheid state against Palestinians. So did Human Rights Watch. So did prominent Israeli human rights organizations. But of course, once Rashida Talibi made this statement, all hell broke loose against her. An American journalist who happens to be Jewish, by the way, in a television program, I can't find the article, so I don't remember the name of the television program. I think I misplaced the article. But basically, she does her homework, engages in research, and ends up presenting a perspective that what Rashida Talibi said was in fact reasonable. That indeed what Amnesty said, what Human Rights Watch said, what numerous human rights organizations said was accurate, that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is in violation of apartheid, Israel is in violation of international law by creating an apartheid regime as defined by the Rome Statute and other relevant international law instruments. As a result, not only was she not allowed to present her segment, it was canceled, and she was immediately fired. I encourage you to look up the story. You will easily find it. And I go back to hear yet again the hypocrisy of focusing on how Muslims need to learn to respect the values of freedom of speech, how Muslims are burdened with the historical and social defects of not understanding what it takes to have a democracy, but the utter hypocrisy in which censorship is easily exercised when it comes to anything that relates to the civil rights and human rights practices of Israel. Here's the thing though. Allah in our lifetime has even shown us a living example of how a people who care about their cause, as ugly and unjust their cause might be. This time the example are not the Zionists that came from all over Europe to colonize Palestine, claiming that they were there 6,000 years ago and that God promised them this land, and reclaimed and in fact brought back from the dead the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language had become a curiosity like Aramaic, a dead language. These strong-willed people, committed people, brought back the Hebrew language from death. And through untold sacrifices, numerous principled moments, created what we see now as the State of Israel. But this time, Allah gave us a living example of Hindu nationalists who are inventing a mythology and who are wrapping up to commit an actual genocide, a thoroughly immoral cause. But how, instead of buying cars and expensive homes, they redirect their resources to reshape the world to serve their agenda and their cause. Every Muslim who says Iranian women do not have the right not to wear the hijab if they don't want to is complicit in the Muslim plight. Every Muslim who chooses to talk about nail polish instead of the poor Afghani schoolgirls that were incinerated to death is complicit in the Muslim plight. Every Muslim woman who is married to a man who says, I want to dedicate my life to serving the Islamic cause, to empowering Muslims, to fighting Islamophobia, can you stand by me and accept a vastly lower standard of living? And if that woman says no, she isn't complicit in the Muslim plight. Every Muslim man married to a Muslim woman who says to him, I want to dedicate my life to fighting Islamophobia and lifting up and empowering Muslims in the world. And to do so, I need to study more. I need to be away from the house more. I need to not serve you as well. And he objects, is complicit in the Muslim plight. Every person who chooses to marry someone who will be richer or provide more luxuries in life instead of a principled existence is complicit in the Muslim plight. And guess what? All your complicity, all of our complicity is tracked by God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, very carefully. Every moment that instead of thinking upon what duties are incumbent upon you, you thought about your rights. I have rights, yes, but you have duties. Let's talk about your duties first before we get to your rights. Every person who focused on their rights in the present circumstance, in the current circumstance, with Hindutva, Hindu nationalism on the rise, with us anticipating the coming genocide against Muslims in India, with us waiting 20 years, 30 years from now, a genocide against Muslims in Europe. I can see it, I can smell it, I can feel it. It will come. And you are complicit. If you thought about your rights instead of your duties, you are complicit. Every Muslim doctor, he enjoys the $500,000 income, or in many situations, much more. And what they busy themselves with is a more prestigious zip code, a larger home, fancier cars, changing out the furniture. You are complicit in the Muslim plight. Others sacrifice for their cause. At a minimum, you can go support someone like C.G. Worldman to make sure that that voice that often speaks for Muslim causes is not silent. I have despaired of this dunya. In my lifetime, regardless of what I talk about, Those who listen remain the same number. Those who care, more or less, remain the same number. I run into rich people left and right in my life, but I have never truly run into a rich person who really understands that their wealth is not theirs and that they're simply entrusted in this wealth so Allah will see what they do with it. I have seen Jews write checks for $150,000 to support their cause. And I've seen Hindu nationalists do the same. A medical doctor write a check for $30,000, $60,000, $75,000. But unless it's to build a mosque where the Muslim doctor will serve on the board of directors, I've never seen Muslims do it. How are we the best ummah? What is Allah talking about? It can't be that Allah is talking about us. And if that's the case, in what sense are we Muslims at all? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم اسألوا الله يستجب لكم إني داع فأمنوا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا اللهم اعف عنا اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم. Allah forgive our sins. Allah strengthen our faith. Allah empower us so that we are not complicit in the subjugation and the brutalization of Muslims all around the world. Allah enable us to see what is right to be right, to see what is light to be light, what is beautiful to see what is beautiful to be beautiful, to have a sense of what is a priority, to fulfill our duties before our rights, and forgive us, Ya Rabbal Alameen. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وأقم الصلاة.